with great pleasure that I introduce our chairman, Terry Clark. Terry and his wife Hildy have driven all the way from California to be here with us this morning. We really appreciate that. Terry is a major volunteer for lots of the organizations up on Georgian Bay, and we've been blessed by having him as our chairman for the last few years. So keep going, Terry.
Okay, thank you very much, David. It's been a blessing for me to be part of this organization. One of the things that we have been looking for a long time is, how this is all going to come together. And so we're very excited to have, all of you here today, and very excited that we're going to be able to watch together the revelations and findings and depths of what is coming out of All Too Clear. Before we get started, however, we want to do what we always do, and that's have a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga, the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples. Our hearts are with all of these people. On behalf of GBF, I also want to express our gratitude for the many donors and volunteers who support our ongoing work. And you may have noticed the banner up front with the Georgian Bay Forever Circle, which has some of the donors on it. And we especially want to thank Doug and Ruth Grant and the Bill and Carol Pryor families, whose extremely generous donations and the GBF have made our participation in the development and the production of this movie possible. David will now introduce the filmmakers and the scientists who will be part of our panel here today.
So before I do introduce our special guest panelists, which includes our filmmaker extraordinaires, Yvonne Drever and Zach Melnick, and our scientists today, the two amazing scientists, Arunas Liskauskas and Aaron Dunlop, rock stars of Georgian Bay. For years, I've been privileged to serve this community as the executive director of this growing organization, Georgian Bay Forever, and I thank you for your support through those years. And we are asking, at the end of the film, we'll send out the survey, as I mentioned, so you could fill that in. Just keep your eyes open for that. A major part of our mission is educating the public, and storytelling is really a critical and important part of educating in science. I would argue that it's even more powerful than the data sometimes, especially to the general public. Scientists, we always get excited about the data because we understand exactly what it means, but when we're communicating that to the public, it's really important to talk about that in a way that resonates with people. And me, kind of in the Western science tradition, being educated that way, I do love graphs and information, but there's some things that really have impacted me. And it's a story from the elders of the Nawash Chippewa, an unceded First Nation in Georgian Bay. And it really put things into perspective with me, and I wanted to share it with you this morning. The elders share the story of a time where the water levels would rise as the lake trout chased the herring. A time when they would watch the lake sturgeon eating cranberries from the bushes along the shoreline. And that really speaks to a time that we've never seen. An ecosystem about 100 times stronger than it is today out in the lake. The biomass today is about 1% of the historical biomass that used to exist. And so it's that vision that we really want to keep in mind, what the bay could be, what a healthy, productive lake and bay would look like. And that's kind of what drives me when I wake up and think about what it is that I'm going to do that day and the projects that we want to undertake. And it's really those stories of the ecosystem that we want to share with our public, because we do a lot of the science research, but unless we're actually resonating with people, making people think about it and making people make decisions in certain ways, it's not as impactful, right? So I hear often from people that their experience of the bay is of beautiful sunsets on sparkling water, waves gently lapping against the shore, or even, powerful storms pounding against the rocks. But there's so much more going on beneath the surface. And so I was thrilled when Zach and Yvonne called me a number of years ago and started talking about the idea of this project that they were thinking about. So Yvonne and Zach run Inspired Planet Productions. They're located on the Saugeen Peninsula. Yvonne typically produces and does all of the work. Zach is kind of the director and cinematographer, but Yvonne's also a director on this part of the project. They're a husband and wife team, and they've co-created more than 40 hours of nature and history documentaries over the last 20 years, including The Land Between in 2012, A Desert Between Us and Them in 2013, and a project called The Bruce in 2018. I first met them when they were working through a project documenting all of the biospheres across Canada. There were 17 one-hour series that they put together for that, and I got to meet them when they were looking at the Georgian Bay biosphere. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce the two of you to come up and say a few words about this amazing film that we're going to see.
Thanks very much, David, and thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning to be with us here. We are indeed a husband and wife team, and we have been making documentaries together for about 20 years, still married. All right. It's true. The first time we met David was on a project called Striking Balance that is when we first heard about the quagga mussel, and we did tell a little quagga mussel story, but we weren't underwater videographers back in the day, so it kind of started there, and we told a little story, and then we moved on to do some other things, and then I'll hand it over to Zach.
So yeah, we kind of put that story in the back of our mind, because what David told us about was something that no one knew about, and it was really big. That supposedly there was, trillions, bajillions of these little mussels totally changing the offshore ecosystem of Georgian Bay. And we were like, wow, that's crazy. We can't really tell that story right now. The technology just doesn't exist. We're not James Cameron. Technology doesn't exist for us to really tell that story. So a few years went by, and then something else happened. The Lake Whitefish collapsed for all intents and purposes in our part of the world, up near the H2O area. And so we started investigating that, trying to figure out what's going on there. And it took a year or so for us to really put these pieces together. But when you put the collapse of the whitefish together with the quagga mussels, you start to realize that my goodness, they're connected. So we started to get more interested in this story because this is having a huge impact, the collapse of the whitefish, on the communities really throughout the Great Lakes south of Lake Superior. And so something else happened, though, that really made this possible is that there's been a huge leap in underwater drone technology. So we can kind of pretend we're James Cameron now and go down to the bottom of the deepest part of Lake Superior if we wanted, and show people what's going on down there in a way we haven't been able to before. So we kind of put all these things together and then went back to David and said, hey, you know what? We think we can tell this story in a way that we can really let people know what's going on out there, and might even help some of the communities who are being so impacted by these decline of fish. And to his credit and to our surprise, he was completely into it. And really, without the support of Georgian Bay Forever, we absolutely would not be here today. And that was really the nucleus of, that contribution was magnified sixfold after that to make what is really, a substantial documentary for Canada, but made almost entirely independently. So we could really put the science and the people at the forefront here. And we're quite proud of what we've put together.
And I'll just continue here. This is the Grant family. Big shout out to them, and the Pryor family, who, if you're here, we'd love to meet you later. As well as. And that also helped us get something called a grant from the Trebek Initiative, and I think some of those folks are here, maybe. Yay! Hey, Dan. And so what's come out of that is 200 days of filming. 150 of those days were underwater using our robot here in the corner. You can come check it out later. And from that, we've made a 3-hour series, which is not what you're going to see today. It's not Lord of the Rings. Today, what you're going to see is a 99-minute version, what we call a feature-length version of the film, where we kind of cut it all down so we can sit here comfortably and enjoy that. And the other thing that's coming out of this is a short version, all underwater short version, that's going to be on display at Science North in the Inco Cavern, playing non-stop for the next 6 years to the 100,000 kids and adults and their adults that come through the Science Center every year. So people are going to see this story, which is pretty great, because the 3-part series is going to be on TVO, we believe, starting in August. And as well, it's going to be on PBS in the States, so your American friends will also get it. And the other cool thing that's come out of this 200 days of filming and 150 underwater days is that we have a whole lot of footage of fish doing stuff. And when you have that, your scientific friends who you've been asking this whole time, how do we find these fish, where do we look, they say, wait a minute, we can do science with that. So in a cool alternative events, we're working with some of the folks who are going to meet very soon to do science on that footage that we've taken. So it's kind of got a twofold thing, great communication and great for science. So we're really excited about that.
I just wanted to say one thing about what you're going to see here today. So think about this like a dress rehearsal on a play, okay? Some of the final polishing stuff is still not done on this feature-length movie you're going to see today, which, as Yvonne mentioned, is just under half of the total content that's in the 3-part series that most people are going to see when they think of All Too Clear on TVO or PBS. So you guys get a special version, but what we actually want you guys to work a little bit today. So we want you to let us know what you think is working, what you like, what you think is not working, what you don't understand, anything really that you think we might be able to improve. We'd like to know, because there is still a little bit of a chance to make some adjustments to this. So that's why we're calling this a test screening, dress rehearsal, if you will. And I think we can invite David back up to introduce our very smart science folks who you can ask questions of when it's time.
So Zach just mentioned, at the end of the film, we are going to have a Q&A session. So while you're watching the movie, if you start thinking of some questions, we've got some scientific experts, and I'm going to introduce you to them now, briefly, for them to make some comments, if they'd like. Arūnas Liskauskas works with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, Forestry, and I'm sure Arūnas has lived through how many name changes of that ministry over your 30-year career? Many. Arūnas has been working as a management biologist with the Upper Great Lakes Management Unit in Nolanstown since about 1992. He is a fishery scientist and also has a MSc Master's in Fishery Science and Fish Genetics. So Arūnas is a great storyteller. I've had the privilege over the last 15 years of hearing him speak many times and sharing the stories of the fish in the Great Lakes, and have been fascinated to learn everything about how many different genetic variants of muskellunge live up the coast of Georgian Bay, and how many species of lake trout there used to be in the lake. There's only 2 left now, and I think there used to be about 12 over the last 100 years. 10 of them have been extricated, as we say, or extincted. So Arūnas, if you have a few opening comments you'd like to make, or drawing attention to things that you'd like people to think about as the film screens, you're welcome to come up and say a few words.
Thank you, David. And thank you for all of you for coming out this morning. How exciting. How exciting. So as Dave mentioned, I am a biologist specializing in fisheries, and I've been working with the Ministry of Natural Resources and now Forestry for over 30 years. And it's been quite an adventure, quite a ride. And I can remember when I first started in '92, that would have been shortly after the discovery of zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. So we were kind of at the early stages of trying to figure out what does this mean to the ecosystem of the Great Lakes. Little did we realize that those dreissenic mussels would totally transform the Great Lakes. The advent of coagula mussels in the late 1990s, early 2000s, created even more disruption to the lake ecosystem. So I remember as a relatively young biologist, just looking in wonder at what was happening in the Great Lakes. And I was still learning about the fish communities, the dynamics of the fish communities and how they were changing, and also understanding the history of the Great Lakes and realizing how profoundly they have been changed even prior to the introduction of zebra, coagula mussels, the round goby, spiny water flea, all these other invasive species that were a result of our determination and commitment to have commerce at any cost. So the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Chicago Sanitary Canal, like there are so many issues affecting the Great Lakes that most people have no idea what's going on. So I became part of the Great Lakes story as a fisheries biologist to see what was happening in Georgian Bay in particular, and the rest of the rest of Lake Huron. Wanted to be part of that story, so I gave a lot of talks to all kinds of groups, showing photos, static photos, trying to be passionate in my delivery. Look, folks, there's things that are happening out there that are not very good. And they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, what is a documentary? It's gotta be at least sixfold times 1,000. So I'm really looking forward to this preview. I'm just a bit player in all this, helped formulate some of the storylines, and really looking forward to seeing stuff that, as a fish biologist, I'm above the surface. I'm not a diver, so I don't really get a chance to see what's going on down there. So this is going to be very exciting. So I'm going to leave it at that. Just a few last words. What a wonderful opportunity it has been for me to learn about the Great Lakes and convey that awareness to the public. But it's also a lament. And when you get to know about the Great Lakes and when you get to know how much they've changed, you realize that, as David said, possibly only 1% of the fish biomass currently resides in the Great Lakes. It used to be much more diverse, much more productive. So it's kind of a tale of two stories, a lament, but also a celebration for how we still have beautiful areas, especially in Georgian Bay.
Arunus was referring to Dr. Aaron Dunlop, who is going to come up and say a few words. Aaron is a senior research scientist with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forests, or in Forestry. She's also an adjunct professor in the Environmental and Life Sciences program at Trent University. Aaron leads an applied science program that focuses on fish populations. You're going to see her pretty quickly in the film today. And she's working on populations in the Great Lakes and Lake Simcoe. Part of her research work took her to far afield, over to Austria and Norway, where she focused a little more on marine fish, including Atlantic cod, but she now leads a comprehensive research program that includes understanding the ecosystem changes caused by the dreissenic mussels. And I'd like to invite Erin up to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be here. And as David said, I'm a research scientist with the Ministry of Natural Resources. I began my current position as a Great Lakes research scientist about 15 years ago. And pretty much immediately I began working on the impacts of dreissenic mussels, in particular focused on lake whitefish, a species that we're going to see a lot of in the film and hear a lot about today. And it was pretty apparent even back then that whitefish were sort of really on a downward trajectory, unfortunately. And so a lot of my research immediately kind of focused on trying to understand what was happening to lake whitefish. And this is because of the importance of this fish to the ecosystem. They're an important bridge between kind of the near shore and the offshore parts of the food web. And they're also an important fish in our commercial fishery. So a lot of people depend on whitefish to support their families, to provide income. And they are incredibly important also to First Nations around the Great Lakes who have fished lake whitefish and have really relied on lake whitefish for their food and for economy and for trade purposes. So a really important fish, and so a lot of my work has focused on them. As far as working on this documentary and adding my insights, it's been an incredibly rewarding experience and a very unique one as a scientist. We sort of tend to do a lot of our work in the lab and writing papers and making our graphs and doing our analysis and all of that stuff. But this has really kind of been a wonderful opportunity for me. Part of what I've loved about this is it's actually, I think, brought the research community of the Great Lakes kind of closer together, actually, just through like sharing some of the footage, and we sort of like have come together, and I've learned a lot about what other people are doing, looking at the impacts of dry-scented mussels. So I've learned a lot and had the chance to kind of get to know other researchers through this documentary experience. So I've really valued that. And then also, just as Yvonne was saying, like, this has given us the opportunity to actually learn some new things about these fish because of the fact that we have these amazing underwater cameras that can capture these images. Before that, we were relying on things like nets and that kind of thing, and I mean, it just doesn't give you the same perspective as actually seeing the fish out there doing their thing, doing their fishing thing. So that's been really amazing, just to actually learn some new things about these fish just through seeing the images. And as Yvonne said, we actually have been doing some scientific research, and we just submitted our first article, actually, about some of the footage that they captured. So yeah, it's been wonderful. So thanks very much for the opportunity to be here, and I hope you enjoy the film.
And Zach, do you just kind of first impressions? You kind of heard an audience give you some feedback. How are you feeling?
Well, I'm glad they laughed a little bit at Harvey because we do kind of find him like low-key funny, so I think that worked out. But no, I think not too many people left in anger or anything, so that's a good sign.
And Aaron, do you have any kind of just first observations looking at the film that you might want to share with folks from your perspective?
I guess it was just really I love seeing all the different parts of the Great Lakes, like that you were surveying and going out and seeing people working in all those different areas, and it just, I guess, emphasized for me that there really is a community of people working on the Great Lakes trying to address this issue. And it's such a huge problem and such a huge issue we're dealing with. We really do have to work together to solve this huge problem, and so I think it just kind of makes that case for me.
Cool. And Arunas, you did kind of mention lamenting. As a scientist and a researcher, you're right. You get to see these impacts before the public has any inkling that they're acting. After seeing the film and kind of, knowing it cuts both ways, the research, how are you feeling about the issue of dry-scented mussels in our Great Lakes right now?
I'm kind of choked up. No, seriously. It's
That I know. I was wondering, how am I going to get on stage? I'm going to look like a real science nerd if I win. But I felt that. That was really good.
yeah, it was. The imagery is amazing, and because it's such a complex story, it's really nice to see various facets get really together. What struck me was how daunting the task is to find out whether we should have any impact. And it might be decadal, it likely is. And just, you can get overwhelmed pretty quickly, but it's heartening and encouraging to know that there's a lot of people that are committed and are working hard to try to resolve what you do. Yeah, but I think the message will be pretty strong, and hopefully there's an audience there that will receive it and realize how significant the change to them.
Reintroducing species like the whitefish to rivers, applying that to Georgian Bay, you have the French River, the Key River, the Moon River. could similar measures, projects be undertaken to introduce them there? And could the cottage associations in those areas play any sort of a meaningful part?
So it's really interesting to hear you say that, because if there was going to be one thing that I was hoping that could be actually kind of a doable takeaway, is that people might think, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have whitefish running in our rivers again? And of course, they've just tried that in one river in Wisconsin, so, in Michigan. But I do believe what they are working on is repeatable elsewhere. I don't actually know if the work has been done to see what rivers in Georgian Bay that would make sense for. I'm not sure. That's maybe a question for these guys, because I know that they would have had the same impacts as far as logging, certainly, that caused them to become extirpated from the rivers in the U.S.
I can try. So, context is everything, and we have a history of commercial fishing on the Great Lakes, including Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. So there is some indication of where the early harvests of whitefish took place. And from what we understand, a majority of that fish was taken from shoal reef periods. There's not a lot of evidence to support significant spawning runs in river systems, particularly in eastern Georgian Bay. Not to say that there wasn't, but a majority of what we understand about lake whitefish is in those reef offshore complexes and where the harvest normally took place. So that's kind of an indicator of where these populations evolved. Life history of whitefish, they're fairly resilient. They can survive in river systems and spawn in rivers successfully. But that's not the case everywhere. You have to be able to support all life stages of that species in order for that to persist. And there just isn't a lot of evidence of that for some of the river systems draining into eastern Georgian Bay and parts of the North Channel.
As a scientist myself, I really have to congratulate you on really bringing science into this presentation and explaining it in a way that everybody can understand. Right? That's a huge job to be able to do that, so congratulations. It seems to me that the goby is maybe potentially a key species to the solution here. I'm just wondering what your opinions on that. I mean, they do eat the larvae, or whatever you call them, of the quagga. Just how could that, and again, are people looking for other biological, biochemical solutions to quaggas and seafood mussels? So just like to get the opinions on that.
The round gobies are kind of a fascinating part of the story, and we certainly have lots of round gobies now in many of these areas of the Great Lakes. I would say that despite those numbers, though, they're still not able, it doesn't seem to really keep down the populations of quagga mussels in particular, especially in those deeper offshore habitats that were sort of highlighted in the film so well. Those quaggas tend to be much larger, and maybe the round goby densities aren't as high in those offshore areas. But another interesting part of round gobies is that they're a really important part of fish diets nowadays. And we see this actually even with lake whitefish. So when zebra mussels first came in and then followed by quagga mussels, whitefish lost that, and we're talking more like the juveniles and adults, they lost that diapria, that freshwater little shrimp type thing that they loved to eat so much and was this important source of food for them. And they had to eat something, so they actually switched to feeding on the zebra and quagga mussels themselves. But this was not a very good source of energy for them, so we saw the growth rates of whitefish really declined. However, now we see in some parts of Lake Huron, for example, including in Georgian Bay and especially in like the central main basin of Lake Huron, whitefish are eating a lot of round gobies now. And so we actually see in a few places that the growth rates they're not declining anymore, they're actually coming up a little bit. So gobies are now this source of food for whitefish, and we see that with many other fish species as well.
If you watch the series version of the show, there are a couple of other ways that people are trying to manage mussels that we do look at, including other biological controls, another biological control, and as well as pesticide. And just, I did want to mention for this crowd, also in the series version of the show, the third episode has a lot of Georgian Bay content featuring Arunus Lesbestus as well. But there is way more in the series version that really kind of digs into some of these questions a little bit deeper.
Cool. So yeah, what you actually saw today was basically episode 1 and 2 together. But there's an entire third part to this story where we actually see whitefish eating gobies and a bunch of other cool stuff. So you'll be able to see that in August on TVO and stream it for free as well.
That's cool. Aaron, did you
Yeah, I
want
was just going to add to the mussel control, kind of alluding to what you wanted to say there, that there is sort of a group that's actively working on trying to investigate different ways of controlling mussels, including like pesticides versus mechanical removal and the tarping and those kinds of things. And so there's actually some kind of very systematic experiments being planned for going into like certain spawning shoals and doing this removal, and then kind of really looking at, for example, with the lake whitefish, are the embryos surviving better? Is there more zooplankton there, or are the larval fish surviving well? So this is a really active area of research for sure.
I was thinking one of the other chapters might be a trip all the way over to the Black Sea.
Oh, we were thinking of it. There's a problem over in that area right now, though. These are actually Ukrainian mussels, so.
I understand there's a little, political tension over there, but we're
yeah,
basically
we try.
inputting that ecosystem slowly over time. Right? Did you have a question?
I just wanted to know if the mussel musher, I'm not sure if it ever worked or if it didn't work.
I know they went back out and they tried it over a much larger area after they, so that was about a year ago that you saw right there. So they have tried it again, and I think there's some trouble controlling exactly where it goes. But it definitely has removed an area outside of Milwaukee, and so Harvey is studying this sort of larger area where they've crushed them. But it's very much still active. All of this stuff is currently very active, like right now. So none of this stuff has been fully worked through. And as Aaron mentioned, there is a lot of exciting work going on, probably maybe starting this year, looking at the potential of removing quagga mussels from fish spawning shoals, but that just was not happening yet when we were making the movie. So this is all very much like cutting edge, happening right now stuff.
I mean, I think part of the challenge for a lot of the scientists we've been working with is that there's kind of a lack of will, as Jason also alluded to in the film, because people haven't been able to see this problem. Even when David told us about it, 7, 8 years ago, we were like, oh yeah, that kind of sucks, right? But now we're able to see that, and I think, if we start kind of get the momentum going, we're going to grow support for doing something about this. There's a lot of concern over things like Asian carp coming to the Great Lakes. And, in my opinion, invasive mussels have already caused way more damage than what might be coming down the pipe there. So now that we can show people this world, we all see film of coral reefs and whales and sharks, and it makes people want to do something to help those environments. But we haven't seen that same kind of attention for the freshwater systems of, especially the Great Lakes, of our world. And so that's kind of one of our goals, is to bring some of that attention to the freshwater systems and to these challenges, so that hopefully, we can start growing some of that will to support these projects.
Yeah, thank you for doing this and making it visible for all of us and the sponsors who help make it happen. Just fantastic. Can't wait to see it on TV. There was a reference somewhere earlier about the quagga mussels but the quagga mussels taking the nutrients out and keeping them in their shells, etc. And as they go on, more and more nutrients are now at the bottom in these little beasts. And one of the things I wondered about, if there was a big die-off, if they find pesticides or something that you do this, get rid of them, the release of all of that nutrients into the water could be to kind of avoid that problem.
Well, I would highly recommend that maybe somebody could make some money available to help fund some seed work on that, because we looked far and wide to try to find anybody doing a successful project where they're removing and finding some economic use for these bajillion of creatures, and so far that's zero, that's none. They might be out there, but I don't think so. To answer the first part, but it could be possible. The trouble is that the vast majority of this biomass is in deep water. So you almost need to use, maybe the same kind of technology they're talking about, mining the ocean floor or something, because getting down to those few hundred feet below the surface and getting those things up is a major technological challenge. And then you'd be able to translate that into something with enough economic value. But it could totally happen. It's just not happening now. As I say, someone should put some money on the table to make that happen. To answer the first part of your question, I believe you are correct. There is a danger that either naturally or through some artificial agent that we add, that if there is a major die-off, I've heard estimates, and these guys can maybe back me up there, but that's, we're talking about the largest amount of biomass in the Great Lakes, down on the lake bed in these mussels. So you're absolutely right. There is that danger, whether they die off naturally or we help them, that it could go the other way, and we just don't know, and that's just part of this quagmire that sort of unfolded there, the quagga quagmire.
The whole document really depressing, saddened me. At the end, it was hopeful. Excellent. With the zebra mussel, is there any chance that they could implode on themselves by starving themselves out?
Yeah, I mean, with invasive species, there definitely is kind of like when you look at kind of the population dynamics of many invasive species, they do show this kind of pattern of coming in, really like exponential growth, sort of reaching some limit and then declining. Sometimes declining a lot, but sometimes just declining sort of a little bit until they kind of reach some sort of carrying capacity, like kind of the number that the ecosystem can support. And so we saw that really with the zebra mussel, for example. They came in first, their numbers like exponentially increased. But then when quagga mussels came in, we saw actually zebra mussels really declined. And now it's really, really rare to actually encounter a zebra mussel versus a quagga. So I would say like, we're not entirely sure what's going to happen. We don't know the future with the quagga mussel, but it could be entirely possible that they do stop at least growing, like increasing in numbers, and may come down somewhat. And then of course we don't know whether another invasive species, unfortunately, would come in and sort of cause another host of changes.
I do just want to comment on the depressingness of the show, the hopefulness. I would say, please watch the series. The third episode of the series is called A Silver Lining, and there's a couple of things that have happened as a result of the quagga mussels that are hopeful and maybe kind of good surprises. I might actually let Arunas talk about one related to lake trout, but it does seem that a lot of non-native species are not as resilient to this new environment. So there's certain species that have been introduced to the lakes over time, and they just can't hang on in the same way that fish that belong here seem to be able to hang on at this moment. So for instance, alewife is a prey fish, one of those little food fish that things like salmon and lake trout would like to eat, and they have dropped off precipitously, as we saw. But that actually has had a positive impact, and maybe I'll let Arunas talk a little bit about lake trout and what we've been seeing with lake trout recently.
Thanks for that. I do have a lake trout pin. I wanted to justify wearing it today. And not having seen the third episode, I'm really excited about lake trout. So that's another part of the story, which is part of my 3-hour lecture. But I don't have time for that. But yeah, with the decline of alewife, lake trout used to feed heavily on alewife, and it created a physiological response, which was a thiaminase deficiency or thiamine deficiency, and they couldn't reproduce. With the decline of alewife, now we're seeing natural reproduction of lake trout, something we hadn't seen for over 50 to 60 years of trying to rehabilitate that keystone predator. So very exciting news on that front. I don't want to give too much more away, but lake trout are reproducing, particularly in the main basin of Lake Huron, and we've seen some significant wild year classes produced, and now a good proportion of the fish, the lake trout that are in the main basin, are wild fish. A little lagging in Georgian Bay in the North Channel, but we're seeing some substantial, I guess, restructuring of the fish community that's benefiting native species. And don't get me going about walleye in Saginaw Bay. That's an incredible story in itself. Is that featured in the lab?
Not the walleye.
Not the walleye. That's the next document.
But we do go into other great fish.
I've got so many ideas that we'll have to talk.
Little sidebar fact, if you had started at the beginning of the film with a 1 meter by 1 meter square, and every second you put a dot on there, it would have taken you about 8 hours of doing that to equal how many quagga mussels are in 1 square meter on the bottom. Did you have a question?
What fish like to eat the round What fish?
Yeah, many fish actually do like to eat the round goby. So the whitefish, that silver, really pretty fish that we saw in the film, they are eating a lot more round gobies now. So that's one species. Also, we know many of the fish that live closer to shore in the warmer waters like to eat round gobies, like smallmouth bass and largemouth bass. Lake trout also eat round goby. So lots and lots of fish do like to eat them because they're nice. I mean, they kind of, they look like a good meal, I think, if you were a fish. They're kind of got nice fat bellies. They're really soft and squishy. I think a lot of fish would like to eat them.
Something I know, my cousin is a diver, and he was cleaning out the pipes at the Pickering nuclear plant, the pipes that put the warm water back into the bay, and of course it attracts mussels big time. And in one quite short period, they collected 16,000 tons of zebra mussels. So they must have a method to do that. I imagine some sort of vacuum cleaner approach, I'm not sure. But that was about 15 years ago. So this technology exists and maybe could be exploited and expanded.
We can't, the mussels are pretty small, about the size of our thumb, so there's not no one's come up with a good economic reason to do it, to remove mussels, from the great offshore waters. So there just hasn't really been the driver to make it happen. And I think it's not like something, when the sea lamprey came in the 1950s, it was pretty obvious, 40s and 50s, the immediate effect it had on fish. They were stuck to fish, and they were killing our fish. And so the connection was really obvious. And I think with mussels, it's taken us a little bit longer to understand how they really are impacting our fisheries and the fish community as a whole in the Great Lakes.
I've got a couple questions, so I'll take them one at a time. The first one, I've been doing a bit of research on the fishing industry in the northern Georgian Bay and how that's declined from the late 1800s up until present time. So at the risk of upsetting all the commercial fishermen in the audience here, I'm quite surprised that you stated that the commercial fishing industry was not a reason for the harvest being decimated. Whereas in the village where I come from, in Killarney, when I was a kid, there was 6 or 7 people fishing out of there. Now there's 1, and Squaw Island no longer has a fishing industry. And all of this happened long before there was ever a zebra mussel or a quagga mussel in the Great Lakes. So how did you guys come to that conclusion that the fishing industry was not partially at least responsible for the decline of the whitefish industry?
Well, these guys actually deal with working with the commercial industry, so I think I'll let Aaron take a shot at that.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, so in the lake whitefish population really peaked in Lake Huron in kind of like the late 90s, and we really saw this kind of population sort of boom that happened leading up to that, so through the late 70s and the early 80s. And you know, we think that the conditions at that time were just really suitable for whitefish. So this included things like, because they were at really low levels before that actually. And we think one of the main reasons that they were able to recover like they did was harvest control measures being put into place in the commercial fishery, as well as getting sea lamprey control in place. So, you know, those were really important aspects to that, but the declines that then happened on the other side of that really do seem to be driven from these ecosystem changes brought about by like the dry-sided mussels. And we see that whitefish have really been impacted like multiple parts of their life cycle. So it's not just the little, you know, larval baby whitefish that aren't getting enough food to eat. We see that even the adults and the juvenile fish aren't getting enough to eat because they lost diaperia. We have concerns over dry-sided mussels sort of impacting the spawning shoal. So there really is this huge ecosystem impact that is driving these. So it's, you know, fishing is not causing the declines, but certainly we have to be really aware of how much fish are being removed through harvest, because that, you know, you want to make sure that we're having enough fish to kind of come to the spawning shoals. You know, these are the fish that have kind of survived through these terrible conditions in the ecosystem and have made it to the spawning shoals. So it still is really important for us to keep an eye on harvest and make sure that harvest isn't too high. So it still is part of the picture. Do you want to add anything on this?
That's pretty comprehensive. It's complicated, and again, I have a lecture that's 4 hours long.
Where do I attend that?
I'll let you know. Just to say that there's a long history of commercial use of the whitefish resource, and there were times when there likely was overexploitation. You know, you could talk about the late 1800s already. You had overcapitalization of the fishery. So there's been boom cycles. This one is kind of a perfect storm, where we had better oversight of the commercial fishery, and I think we were managing it fairly well. We reached a peak, historical peak in the early 2000s, and now this is more of an ecologically based decline. But there are cumulative factors, right? They all contribute to it. So I guess it's complicated, but great question.
I used to work on the cargo ships on the Great Lakes, so I know from that map that you guys showed of where the quagga mussels are taking root in Lake Superior, that specifically Duluth and Thunder Bay, those are two major ports for the lake freighters. And I know that there's now requirements for deep sea ships coming into the Great Lakes to do a ballast exchange mid-ocean. And as far as I know, I haven't sailed for 15, 20 years, that there is no such program when you're going between the lakes. So looking at that map, I'm thinking, wow, any cargo ship that is taking on ballast in any of the other 4 lakes other than Superior and discharging it in Lake Superior is going to be primarily in Duluth and Thunder Bay harbors. So do we need to implement or try and implement a ballast to water exchange program before ships go up onto Lake Superior to keep the quagga mussels from taking root there further?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I know that's been brought up actually by the shipping industry itself, right? They're saying, hey, we have to do this deep sea double exchange, then go to Montreal and be 100% inspected, but going from lake to lake, there's no similar type of, and there's no requirement for strainer screens or things like that. So the industry itself, the shippers themselves are saying, hey, like, how do we actually address this? And there are a lot of new systems being certified for actual treatment of the ballast water instead of just passive, exchanging the tanks. So it's definitely topical, and I don't think they've solved it yet, but people are talking about it down there.
When we were doing that filming in Lake Superior, which is where we got a lot of those whitefish shots, you could see that there were multiple age classes of fish there. So you could see the little fish and like the bigger fish, and they were all sort of hanging together. When we could find them in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, you were only seeing those bigger, older fish. So that's unscientific, but another sort of indicator. You hear that from the fishers as well, that we're only catching those big, older fish. And that's, not related to fishing. That sounds like it's related to the fish not having enough food or whatever. Just the small fish not being able to become those big fish.
So, having spent many, many years sending chemistry models down and pulling nets up to try to understand what's going on in the lakes, it's really nice to see it presented visually as well as you have done. And the narration went very well with it. I found myself every time I saw a segment and I went, I don't know if that explains it all, the next segment would. So things are kind of put together in a very good fashion. It's nice to hear some hope coming up in the third episode. Or maybe we can get Arunus to join Georgian Bay forever, David. But having worked on chemical pollution, we've learned through acid rain or phosphorus, you can turn the tap off and the systems will respond. Biological pollution, once it's there, it tends to recreate itself, and that makes it very, very challenging. So the important thing is to keep it out to start with. And then my one comment, somebody mentioned the Black Sea earlier. They've been populated by quaggas and zebra mussels for hundreds of thousands of years. What does their system look like compared to ours?
I think part of the thing is that over there we have, the mussels and the fish co-evolved so that, they have fish that A, think of mussels as food, as part of the system, and B, fish with, most of our fish in the Great Lakes don't have jaws strong enough to crush the adult shells. So there are some that can, but most of our fish don't see them as food, and the other group of them just can't physically eat them. And so in those areas where they belong, there are animals that are like, oh, this is food, and so their populations are kept in check by predators that have just evolved with them. Anybody else?
I also heard, and I don't remember where, but I think they have really big gobies there. Have you guys heard this? That they have gobies capable of eating larger mussels, basically. So maybe
coming into the sea, the Black Sea, and the surface water is fresh and it drains out, and they have this underwater river, and it's a very complicated marine / freshwater / mixing kind of environment too. So I'm of the mind that we don't want to bring those bigger goby over as a solution, but that's the kind of stuff that sometimes people look for.
I don't have a question. I have a comment, and I'm one of those people that just kind of got invited to come, not knowing what to expect. We were coming, my husband said, we're going to go see my brother's passion project. He's got this film we should see. And you blew me out of the water. Like, I really am so impressed. Like, I just found those little whitefish so darn cute, and I have so many people that go through, you've got to see this. Like, this is so enlightening. And the narration was wonderful. It kept my attention the whole time. And I'm excited to see where things go. And you did a wonderful job with something that could have been.
because that's ultimately the goal, right? So we need to be able to sort of entertain and interest and inspire, and so if you think it's done that, and then we got to get to those people who aren't innately interested in things like mollusks, So it's great to do. Yeah, thank you very much.
I really enjoyed that.
I think just another short plug. So for the premiere event, which will be on August 10th at the Stockey Center in Paris-Town, that will be open to the public. So you should totally tell all your Georgian Bay friends to come and check it out and see the final version there. We'll be announcing that very soon, and get your tickets.
Yes, we will.
Cool. You know, like everybody here, I think we all thought that was an amazing film. And, I don't know whether I'm up to another 3 hours on TV, but we do binge watch other programs, so maybe we can do that with this too. You've been some very interesting questions and interesting responses. I wanted to change the topic just slightly, but it's Georgian Bay and your Georgian Bay people here. I hope that everybody in this room is aware of the enormous man-made threat that TC Energy is proposing to carry over Georgian Bay with a vast pump storage plant on what's probably the other side of the bay for most of you. This is at Meaford. They wish to excavate a 375-acre reservoir on top of the Niagara Escarpment, connect it to tunnels and intake pipes underneath Georgian Bay, they're going to tunnel under the bay, and move 23 million cubic meters of water every day up to this reservoir, flush it back to create electricity in the daytime. It's called pump storage. The independent electricity system operator for Ontario has twice ruled it's not of economic value, but the government keeps pushing ahead with it. So I hope you'll, if you don't already know about it, you'll learn about it and put some pressure on your local politicians and other people to stop it. There are better ways to store energy. Thank you.
I think that's a topic for a whole other film, but I did want to comment on the man-madeness challenge here. You know, when we think about the gobies, humans are the reason, or the gobies, now I'm making a goby film. When we think about the mussels and the gobies and all these other invasive species, humans are the reason that they're here in the first place. And when we think about, you know, maybe there's not much hope, you know, we were the ones that started this in the first place. So if we put enough time and effort into it, we as people can do something about it now. Our Great Lakes might not look the exact same as they did before these new animals came to them, but if we help our native species hang on through this time of change, we might still have them in the Great Lakes of the future. So that's kind of what I see. What we can do is help the species hang on to get through this time of change and really support the organizations like Georgian Bay Forever that are doing great work to help our native species keep thriving.
I'm not going to address what was just commented on, but just a bit of a diversion, maybe some levity. If we were looking for a mascot for Lake Huron and All Too Clear, and this probably goes without saying, that I didn't realize how charismatic Diaperia are. And to me, to have that as our poster mascot would be great.
Yeah, I think you guys should do a diaperia restoration program, or at least a public education program. They actually survive for quite a long time out of the water. Contrary to popular belief, they're actually much tougher. Everyone said they would, so in order to shoot that scene, we actually had to go to, because they aren't really in any of the lower Great Lakes, so we had to go to Lake Superior, and we used a Ponar grabber to go down that same thing that you saw, picking up the mussels.
We didn't have train though, we did it by hand.
And it was about 130 feet or something, and so we got the mud out, and we built little sets, and then we shot that. But it took about 2 weeks of work just to get those shots there of those events.
I do want to say on the Diaperia mascot front, which is clearly where this conversation should go, is that there are actually Diaperia stickers that we have made that are on the back table with other literature, as well as the whitefish magnet. So if you want to take one of those, you are welcome.
Yeah, I remember that was presented, I think, Tom Delper at NOAA. Yeah, we did the dipariah charts and showed how they just disappeared. You used to be able to see them basically like circling Lake Michigan from space. There were so many in the lake, like the density of those was enormous. And when the mussels came in, they just basically disappeared. And it's a direct kind of correlative element that you can pretty much attribute the decline of the dipariah to those invasive dry sonnets, right? So significant alteration of the food web. We as an organization actually altered our mission statement because when I first joined the organization about 15 years ago, we said, we want to help restore the native ecosystem. We had to change that to say we want to restore a healthy ecosystem because how could a small organization like Georgian Bay ever get rid of quadrillions of quagga mussels that are on the bottom, right? So I think you're right, we have to look for those opportunities to help sustain existing species and make sure there's biodiversity in the lake, make sure that these things can be productive and look for opportunities to bias ourselves towards native species, but not necessarily make it any worse by bringing more in, right? So.
Maybe it's more of a comment, but I do a lot of work with invasive plant species, and it's interesting when you remove the invasive plant species, then the seed bank that's there is restored. It's not always, depends on where you're working, it's not always native species, but sometimes it's just a better alternative. But what I thought about that film was that you went to some effort to show how interconnected everything is. And I think that so often, and you mentioned about how humans have, looked at the Great Lakes as economically rather than as a natural ecosystem and what can they do with it economically, but not thinking about the other connections. And I think that's one of the things that I would like to see really emphasize is how important all of those interconnections are. And I think it's really an emotional subject for me too, but I think it's so important for people to understand, like cottagers who decimate all the native plants on their beach because they want pure sand, like in the videos that they show of the Caribbean, and not appreciating how important those plants are to the local animals and seeing those interconnections. So I thought one of the things that I really took from the film was how you could show that you do one thing and how the repercussions are so great. And I think that's a really important message for everybody who's not a scientist to understand. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that's kind of our job as science communicators and storytellers, is that we get to the hard place. We don't have to do all the hard science work. These guys do all the hard science work. And we can get to the hard place and hopefully get some of that movement going to support the work that they're doing.
One of the things that I found really fascinating, and it's somewhat related to your comment, is that Arunas mentioned how the lake trout are amazingly coming back to Georgian Bay and Lake Huron and spawning naturally by themselves. Where, well, you know what? The place where we were filming them spawning the most was like 6 feet away from a cottage building. So that shoreline is such an important area for native species to use. And I know that struck me, is that, my goodness, that is, and they had no idea, of course. I'm sure they don't know. They didn't know that there was, this species that had been extirpated for decades was coming back, mere feet from their boathouse, but it totally was. And so, keep that shoreline natural, folks.
Yeah, good point.
Wondering if you had any consideration to climate change. You beautifully illustrated the food chain and how these fish were being fed, but are any of the species at particular risk for rising water temperatures?
So these guys have a better answer for that. We in particular decided that, other folks mostly have the climate change thing under control. We try to specifically look at this other issue. But I do know that lake whitefish are sensitive to loss of ice. I think they might be a little more sensitive to loss of food, but I'm going to send over to Erin.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question for sure, and we are doing research to look at this. So basically, there's a lot of research going on, but basically to understand kind of the interplay between the effects of the mussels together with what's happening with climate warming. In the film, it talks a little bit about the loss or the decline of the spring plankton bloom. And certainly mussels are a huge part of that, but we also do know that the loss of ice cover, the warming of the waters also really influences the timing of when that bloom happens. And so, one of the avenues of research specific to whitefish and some other species is trying to understand how the disruption of the timing of when that bloom is happening, if that's being sort of affected by climate warming, and whether that's leading to kind of what we call a mismatch between the larval fish when they're hatching and needing to find food, and like the timing of that plankton bloom. So if there's a mismatch in the timing there, the larval fish are out there, but there's not food to eat. And so, we think that it's quagga mussels for sure are playing probably the more substantial role at this time, but the climate is also having an impact there as well.
One of the, again, not a scientist, but one of the interesting things was that if you compare Green Bay, Wisconsin, which is Georgian Bay in Lake Michigan, same latitude, right? In Green Bay, they're doing spectacularly well. Georgian Bay, not so much. So that's just one thing to look at when you're trying to figure out. And one thing, the difference is in Green Bay is that they have a lot more nutrients there from various things. So that's just one element of that to consider when you're wondering about how important is ice maybe.
Aquatic species are actually more sensitive to the temperature changes because they're used to a much narrower kind of temperature band, right? So I think we know that climate change definitely is a major player. We've seen and measured, water temperature, surface water temperature increases in Lake Huron. Storms are increasing, ice cover's declining. When you expose those shoals in the wintertime, without the ice, you just get more turbulence, right? Because the wave action actually goes deeper and takes over, and the ice motility declines. Tons of impacts, but as Zach said, that's a whole story. And we do try to tell that, and we have our other communication tools as an organization, our newsletters and things like that, or interesting reports that the government publishes that will always point our audience towards. So it's absolutely an issue, and absolutely having an impact. And some species like alewife, you can change the temperature for an aquatic species by 2 degrees, and it stresses that species out, like it's fatally stressful. So it doesn't take much of a change to actually cause some significant impacts in the ecosystem. So good question, thanks for bringing that up. And given where we are with climate change now, hottest recorded year last year, hottest months again happening. And I think the most depressing thing I read in the last 3 years was one of the political candidates in the state convened a meeting with the top oil executives and said, if you raise $1 billion, I'll get rid of all of the environmental controls on climate change. I mean, that's just depressing, right? And if any business leader actually does anything like that, it's like you're sacrificing the entire planet for a 4-year election cycle. That seems crazy.
Thank you. First, I just wanted to offer my congratulations. I think you did a fantastic job, particularly in communicating science in an understandable way, which I'm really big on. But I was particularly taken by every time you interviewed a scientist on the screen or talked about a particular study, the little location map popped up. And I thought that was fantastic because so often you see these documentaries and they talk about places, and if you're not intimately familiar with the geography, you just have no idea where you're actually talking about. But this put everything into perspective, and it really showed the extent to which you covered the lakes and looked at different areas. So I think that was an excellent job. My other
Yvonne makes the math, so she's happy about that comment.
My other point, it's really, it might be totally irrelevant because you say that there's a 3-part series and I only saw a snippet of that. So you may have covered this, but I'm old and I went to university in the 70s and I was involved in a lot of my early career in the 80s when the cleanup of the Great Lakes was a huge thing. And you did talk about the early cleanup of the Great Lakes, and you showed pictures of the foam, and you talked about the algae. But then you went on to talk about the lack of phosphorus, which for sure is a problem. But it almost gave the impression that we shouldn't have cleaned up the Great Lakes, because what actually didn't come across were all the other impacts of the eutrophication of those lakes and the early problems, particularly in places like Lake Erie, and the impacts on dissolved oxygen from the eutrophication of those lakes, and then how that in fact impacted, and the additional chemical contamination that came with all the industry and the lack of pollution control from the sewage treatment plants, which also has been cleaned up. So, you know, I think it's great, and I think it was just maybe me taking a little bit of, oh my God, we certainly should have cleaned up the Great Lakes, because you did talk about later on adding phosphorus, which I understand completely, but I just didn't want people to get the impression that maybe we made a mistake cleaning up those lakes.
Sure, I mean, we were being a little bit of tongue-in-cheek there, right? So we wanted to, because it's such a different way of thinking about the world, what we were trying to communicate here, we wanted to give a little bit of the reaction like you got there. If you look in the, if you do watch the 3-part series, we talk a little bit more about Lake Erie, and the fact that is that area and Green Bay and a couple other spots still do have problems with algae blooms, but we really thought that our job with this project was to shine that light onto that offshore zone where people never go, and just this whole thing that no one knows like sort of anything about, and then just to be, as I say, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and that's kind of, we tried to present it that way too, but you know, I totally appreciate where you're coming from for sure.
Yeah. Thank you for the question and comment. Like, I kind of tend to agree somewhat as well. Like, and just to make it clear, like, there is such a thing as too many nutrients for fish, including whitefish. You know, I do a lot of research on Lake Simcoe, as Ann knows, and there it's very clear that, you know, we had a situation with too many nutrients in that lake, which causes dissolved oxygen issues, and we saw whitefish, the whitefish population there collapsed because of too many nutrients in Lake Simcoe. So it is a balancing act, and that's where the challenge really lies, right? Like, too many nutrients, not good, too few nutrients, also not good. So there's something in the middle there, and that's what makes it, I think, really tricky for us to think that we are capable of dialing things so specifically to find that middle ground. Yeah, I think that's a real challenge that we have.
And I think that's what the latest science out of the Large Lakes Observatory in Duluth is saying, that our ability to even control that at all, because of the fact that most of the nutrients now is in mussels, has been hugely reduced. So it is now a much bigger problem than when our ancestors people were trying to deal with this in the Great Lakes in the era when like folks like Bob Hecky were working on it in the 60s, for sure.
Thank you very much for that film. That was excellent.
We just finished watching something on the planet on TV. We got a 65-inch and it was fabulous, but this is really good.
That's very good.
My question for you is that here's the thing, commercialization of these mussels, right? I so enjoy a bowl of PEI mussels. I'm wondering if you tried them since you had your hands on.
No, thanks for too many contaminants, and they're just like the size of your thumb or your like thumbnail, right? They're really, and they aren't all that appetizing. I mean, you do have respect for them. They are pretty cool, but maybe you can find some way to remove the shells and make them into a, something.
Nice goo of mussels.
Great, well, thank you very much. Thank you for the great questions and for coming today. Thanks to our panelists.